Welcome to the Giving Voice to Depression podcast, produced in partnership with Mental Health America of Wisconsin. We are your co-hosts, Bridget
and Terry. Each week, through intimate, candid conversations with guests, we explore different perspectives on and experiences of depression. We keep it real because the illness is real. We keep it hopeful because there truly is hope in spite of what depression tells you.
We are not experts or therapists. We're sisters and best friends who live with depression and have interviewed hundreds of others who do as well. By sharing stories of lived experiences, we expose depression for the lying bully it is. Hi, Terry.
Hello, Bridget. So, as far too many of us know, the grief process is always a difficult one. A loss by suicide can make that process even more complex, challenging, and traumatic. An article from the Harvard Medical School lists several factors that make a suicide different. We're going to run through them quickly, but we'll link to the publication because we think it has great information from a highly credible source and that you might want to read it in more detail.
The first unique circumstance is a traumatic aftermath. Quote, death by suicide is sudden, sometimes violent, and usually unexpected. Police and others may also be involved, which can add to the trauma. Another is recurring thoughts. Quote, a suicide loss survivor may have recurring thoughts of the death and its circumstances, replaying over and over the loved one's final moments or their last encounter in an effort to understand, or simply because the thoughts won't stop coming.
Other unique circumstances include stigma, shame, and isolation. As we all know, there's a lot of ignorance, prejudice, and secrecy around mental illness in general and suicide in particular. According to that Harvard article, quote, the decision to keep the suicide a secret from outsiders, children, or selected relatives can lead to isolation, confusion, and shame that may last for years or even generations.
And their last example, mixed emotions. Quote, after a homicide, survivors can direct their anger at the perpetrator. But with a suicide, the victim is the perpetrator. So there is a bewildering clash of emotions. Today's guest, Deb Sherwood, knows all those challenges firsthand. 8 years ago, her husband, Bob, took his life. They were both journalists, and after long, successful careers telling other people's stories, Deb sat down with us to share theirs, in the hope that her words, experience, and process will reach, teach, and even help heal others.
I was married for over 31 years, and fortunately to the same man, and we had a remarkable marriage. We met in a television newsroom. He came in as a news director at a television station I was already working for as a reporter anchor. And eventually we got married, and we continued to work together for many, many years. And we had an amazing relationship. We're together virtually 24 hours a day. Mm-hmm. If we could have figured out how to be together more, we would have. Oh. So it was really one of those kinds of relationships.
Unfortunately, Bob got very ill.
He ended up with Parkinson's and a number of heart issues, and also had a knee replacement surgery that went very, very badly, got infected right away. Had several surgeries where they finally got the infection under control, but he could never get out of the wheelchair again.
Her once vibrant husband now relied on her for virtually everything.
The night that really kind of brought everything to a close, he needed my help, 3 or 4 times. And on the last time, I said, I don't know how much longer I can do this. I was exhausted, and I had to work the next day. He had a doctor's appointment when I finally got home from work that day, and it was just sort of like, I'm exhausted. And he just looked at me with nothing but love in his eyes and says, I know.
It was an exchange many caregivers have had. One so common, there's a phrase for it, empathy exhaustion. But Deb regrets it to this day.
That morning, and I worked very early hours, I got up and, as usual, went out to check on him, and he was fine because he was sleeping in a recliner at that point because he couldn't get in and out of bed. But it was obvious that he was having a very, very bad day. We had an agreement that if he ever needed me to stay home, that I would do so, but he needed to ask. I wasn't going to say, I'm going to stay home today, you tell me when you need me. He made his toast while I went in and got dressed and came back out, and he just looked miserable. And I just said, you really look like you're in a lot of pain. He goes, yeah. So I got him back into the living room and made sure it was set up for lunch and, a lot of water and that type of thing.
Deb left with her routine goodbye to Bob and their cats. She worked that morning, anticipating her husband's daily check-in.
He would always let me know partway through the day that he was okay. He'd just send me a text because I was in a position where I couldn't take calls. And I didn't get one that day. I got a little worried. On my first break, I tried to reach out to him, couldn't reach him, and I thought, well, he's probably just in the other room, didn't have a cell phone with him. So I said, just send me a text or an email when you get to a device, and didn't hear back. So at lunchtime, I reached out again, didn't hear back. So eventually I said, there's a problem. He had fallen before and couldn't get up. So I thought, that's probably what happened because he was so weak that morning. So I told my boss, I said, I've got to go home and check on him. That 15-minute trip home was like the worst trip in the world. But, everything's going through your mind, but this never entered my mind what the reality was that I was going to face.
Deb said her first emotion on entering their home was deep relief. Bob hadn't fallen. He was in his recliner.
Then I realized that there was a problem. My mind just focused on the fact that he wasn't responding to my touch, my words. And first thing I did was gather up the cats, put them in a bedroom so that they would be safe, and called 911. And I said, I think my husband has passed. And they said, we'll send somebody right out. And, they did.
Either the angle at which she'd first seen her husband, some self-protective instinct, or both, had prevented Deb from seeing the full truth until after she'd called for help.
I looked then again at Bob and realized at that point that he had taken his life. That's when my mind finally recognized the whole picture. But my mind just wouldn't let me do it until I guess everything else was safe. So I immediately stepped outside because, I covered suicide as a reporter, and I knew I just needed to, leave the scene and let them do what I knew they had to do. So they came up and I said, my husband's taken his life.
That tragic fact changed everything that happened afterwards.
One of the officers immediately took me to the ambulance and, started the interrogation from hell. Not that he did anything wrong. It's just nothing's off limits. I mean, they're trying to figure out, is it really a suicide? Is it a homicide? I'm a person of interest. I found him. It's my husband. They don't know what they've got. They just know that they have a dead person in their home and a violent death. So everything that you could be asked, how long did you married, have kids, what's your relationship like, to, what's your financial situation, to health issues. And that's when he asked me, he said, do you think that Bob was concerned that he would end up like in a nursing home or something? And it just really kind of hit me at that moment. It was sort of like my words of, I don't know how much longer I can do this, really had hit a mark. And I think he was really worried at that point that that's where it was going to end up, and that would not be acceptable for him. And so all of a sudden you're kind of going, this is my fault. I mean, I crossed a line with him, and I know better. I know words, and I know him. And why did I say that? So you go into that guilt mode.
Guilt, another difference between suicides and deaths by natural causes. A police search of your every room, closet, and vehicle also makes that list. The coroner and the police finish their business and leave. And Deb is alone in what is now her house with what are now her cats, left to deal with shock, grief, and the solo task of notifying friends and relatives.
Then you got the decision, do I tell people? It was the Tuesday before Thanksgiving. Do you tell people on that phone call, if you don't reach them, what happened, or do you just ask for a call back? And on the spur of the moment, I thought, I've got to tell them that he took his life, because at least that'll give them a moment to comprehend what happened before they call back to me. So hopefully it will be an easier conversation.
It was when Deb started getting callbacks that the depth and power of stigma became clear.
That's kind of when the horror hits me, where people are saying, you cannot tell anybody what happened because you'll ruin his professional reputation as a journalist. And it was sort of like, okay, that makes sense to me. I mean, I don't want anybody thinking, what a weak man or, a lost soul. I don't want that to be their memory of him, with all the things that he did in the business and, throughout his life. And so I said, okay. I didn't want them judging him. I didn't want them judging me. So I really only told, family, a few very close friends.
Because he'd been ill, you didn't have to have like a cover story. They just assumed his illnesses had led to his death, correct?
That is correct,
yeah.
right,
Yeah,
right.
okay.
It was just, he passed, and one friend said, I tell people his heart gave out, because it did.
Oh.
And it was sort of like, that's a good answer,
Right. How long did you keep the secret?
Outside of like medical and a few close people, a good year.
Okay. Was there a turning point? I mean, at some point you just said, oh, this is ridiculous, I'm not healing, or what caused you to say, this shouldn't be a secret?
Well, I think I realized that even going to like suicide support groups, that people need to talk about it, and it does help to talk about it, and it can make a difference for other people as well. And going through like an intensive outpatient program, when I finished that, everybody said, you have made such a difference.
So what was the cost to you personally to have to keep that secret?
I think I struggled with just doing anything more than what I had to get by. Mm-hmm. I think it impacted how I took care of myself, what I felt I was worth as a person. Sort of like if the person I love more than anybody else in the world did this, and I feel like my words were kind of the push over the cliff.
In the same way a death by suicide is different, so is the grief over it. Keeping the truth about her husband's death hidden impacted Deb's ability to heal.
Oh, definitely. Without a doubt, it was delayed. Because, nobody could support me or root against me. They just was sort of like, oh, he died. Okay, that's really sad. And, we move on with life.
Now.
Exactly. Yeah. He's in a better place. And I'm thinking, oh, man. People sometimes will say that even at our suicide support groups, well, he's in a better place. And I keep thinking, don't say that, because, people that have suicide ideation, I don't want to hear that, you take your life and you're going to be in a much better world than you are currently. It's sort of like we think we have to be so careful about what we exactly that final push, like you're indicating there. And but yes, it definitely delayed my healing.
I just think that, having to have that guilt is the word I'm going to use, and I don't know if it's
It is guilt,
okay?
absolutely.
To have that for a full year inside of you when you're also grieving the loss of someone you cherished. I just, my heart breaks that you had all of that at once.
I still have the guilt. I will always carry this guilt. Most people will say, wasn't you, that's really where he was. I really think it was spur of the moment. I think that it was just sort of like, I need to not burden her anymore financially, physically, psychologically. I think she would just be better off if I was not here, and I can't contribute anymore. I do believe that, but I think the words that I said about I don't know how much longer I can do this, even though it was said in just exhaustion and not thinking, really had that impact. I do have a therapist who I told the story to, and I said, what's your opinion? And he said, yeah, it had an impact. And I thought, thank you. Mm-hmm. I appreciate your acknowledging it, because I know it did. And whether everybody in the world tells me it didn't, I know it did.
And that thought of being a burden and that everybody would be better off without me, comes into the minds of people who are suicidal, whether or not they've been ill and their wife said that. It's a very, very common thought.
Yep.
And I was unaware how common until I started interviewing attempt survivors.
It's really so sad, but people can't talk about it. And I really thought that Bob and I had the kind of relationship that we could talk about anything because that's what we did for a living. We talked about everything. And yet here's the biggest decision of his life, and I'm not a part of it.
There will be people who hear this story and say, I said the wrong thing too, and she moved on, and that's going to be so healing to them. So I'm really grateful.
Well, thank you. That's really my hope, is that it can make a difference. I can't change what's happened in my life. I can only appreciate all that we had together, and it was magnificent. I will never forget him. He will never not be a part of my life, but I need to share the experience to let people know that it is okay to talk about it. It's really important to talk about it, not just to end the stigma or help in that regard, but also, in my opinion, to help heal, because that was probably the worst decision I made, is to not tell people. It just kept it all stewing in my head and suffering alone.
So how now does talking about it make you feel? How is it different than that?
Well, I'm a stronger person now. I'm much more empathetic. I really listen to not only the words people say, but how they say them, so that you kind of read into things a little bit more. And if somebody says, okay, you kind of go, well, is something going on? So you kind of push a little bit more. Just by saying, it's okay to feel bad, but you've got to talk about it and see what can be done to prevent, suicide from happening in the first place. And God forbid if it does happen, what can you do in the aftermath? Because it's a landmine, and you just have to be able to figure out where to place your feet. And that answer is going to be different from you, from me, from every person that you talk to, and to be okay with that fact. That it is okay to feel one way when everybody else seems to feel another way. If it helps you, that's what's important.
Oh, secrets can be so burdensome and isolating, crippling.
Absolutely. I am just so grateful at the level of, honesty and revelation that Deb was willing to do for this, because it'd be real easy to not mention you'd said something. But we know, and lots of people know firsthand with certainty, that there are a lot of other people out there. And when you start combing through your words and your actions and the things you didn't say and your inactions, we can all regret the last encounter in any encounter, even one that doesn't end in death. So I thought that was really helpful to hear that, and then to also just realize what, I think she called it a landmine, afterwards. And that's another reason we're going to link to that Harvard article, because it has a list of resources, and you might need anything from a support group to, services in your own home to anything. So it's just good to have some idea that there are some resources available.
Absolutely. And next week, Terry's going to talk again with Deb about some of the outrageous and painful things that people said to her that truly made things worse, and some suggestions on more enlightened, constructive things to say and do.
Again, so thank you, Deb, for talking with us. Thank you, Bridget. And we'll be back next week with more.
Bye. We truly hope that our podcast brings a little more understanding, helps you better articulate your experience of depression, or better understand how to support someone else's.
We invite you to join us for daily posts on the Giving Voice to Depression Facebook page and on Twitter and Instagram at Voice Depression. It is a comfort to be among fellow travelers on depression's dark road.
And remember, if you're struggling, speak up. If someone else is, listen up.